the chapel was the first thing to be built, and it was consecrated in 1914.
That's the chapel over there.
That's the chapel over there. It's split into two parts. We'll see when we go in. It's quite distinct. Two separate chapels. That was part of the competition. We might talk a bit about why it links into this sort of question of monasticism in a way. So that was built first. Great War happened. Buildings suddenly became very expensive. Benfield and Loxley, who are the builders who were working here, lost, I think, in the space of a month, 70% of their workforce. So the people who are actually working on the house, having built the chapel quite quickly in under budget, they were suddenly left with people who couldn't go to war because they were too old or whatever, and a much depleted building force. So what happened next is parts of this range were built that face onto St Giles. Then came the library in two parts. They managed to negotiate
That's
to.
The library
that's
over
the library
there.
over there. They managed to negotiate to build it in two parts, and that got done. Realised that they had no money left, so this whole range was left incomplete. And it was only in the 1920s that a different architect, a pupil of Lutyens, came and finished it off quite sympathetically. It's actually hard to tell.
Very
that it's a
sympathetic,
different
yeah.
architect. You can tell that there's a little bit on St Giles where it doesn't quite fit in, but this I think is absolutely perfect. These are what we call the cloisters. This stained glass window was Temple Moore, the architect I mentioned.
Yeah.
Had a son who was his only son, his hope of. Shall we wait?
It's all right.
You going in?
I'd almost hoped it was a comedy moment.
What was it? So Temple Moore, Richard Temple Moore was his son and his hope of actually carrying on the practice. And his first job that he entrusted his son with was to be clerk of works here, overseeing the progress of the building. At the end of the war, 1918, October, he was travelling on a boat from Ireland to England, and that was torpedoed by a U-boat, and his son died before Temple Moore, and Temple Moore died 2 years later, never really got over it. Temple Moore, in memory of his son, had this window put in.
This is a memorial
for his son, and it says here, only son of Temple Moore architect and his partner on this building. 2 years later, Temple Moore's having his own memorial window put in, so it's quite a sad little...
The one that's really confusing me is, how is one being martyred by a cotton reel?
So that's it's a measuring tape.
But it's definitely a measuring line.
It's a measuring line, and there's actually a series of correspondence in the archive relating to that. That took about 2 years to decide on it because there was a back and forth. It's so often the case in these Oxford building projects. They decided to involve somebody very clever, and who objected to slowed the process. And objected to the nature of the measuring line, said that's not accurate, right. And it was just this ridiculous back and forth. But we'll see some better glass in the chapel. I don't actually rate this glass. If you look up in those lights there, that top one on the right is Temple Moore's masterwork, St Wilfrid's in Harrogate, which is a wonderful church. If you ever get the chance to go and visit, that's the temple at Jerusalem.
That's the temple at Jerusalem.
Yeah.
More cloisters. These weren't actually intended to have been built on the original plan, and it was only when they'd already started building that Temple Moore realised, gosh, to get from the house to the library, you'd have to walk through the quad outside in the cold. So they had these cloisters built on at a bit of expense, which the principal at the time was quite annoyed about. But I think we're certainly grateful for them now. So this is the chapel. I think it's good to come right as far back as you can because you really get a sense of the perspective. And it's all about scale in here. Temple Moore is described by one of his colleagues that he was as close to a medieval master mason as you could get. Incredibly practical idea of building. He was ambidextrous. He used to sketch and with one hand and make annotations with another, and draw arches just by going like that. Well, this is the big chapel, or to give it its proper term, the Chapel of the Resurrection. The building project, the competition brief was that there had to be two separate chapels. It's interesting to see how the different architects interpreted that. Most of them, they had a big chapel and a sort of side chapel, like a lady chapel. But Temple Moore really got it, because what the principal and the chapter wanted was a chapel for bigger services for masses, for Sunday provision, which is what this is still used for, but also a chapel for the daily offices and for the community, community of residents to pray amongst themselves, as at a monastery. Temple Moor based it on Franciscan priories and had it set up exactly like a medieval priory church. And I think in the early days, you would have masses where people from the university would come in here and there'd be something going on behind the screen just for the residents, like at a monastery.
Which is not totally removed from the Sunday morning experience here now, in the sense that morning prayer, which is more often the serving team made up of residents and others, is often happening in the Chapel of the Blessed Sacrament, whilst people are gathering in here for the Mass that will then happen in the larger space.
You don't ever have choirs competing from one side to the other?
No.
There's only one choir.
Exactly. Battle of the bands.
What I'm looking at there, that's not a rood screen.
It's a pulpitum,
Yeah.
to give it its official term.
And the word of the week this week is pulpitum. Pulpitum.
What makes it a pulpitum? It's stone, and actually there's underneath the rood there's another altar there, and that's actually got the altar stone which Dr. Pusey used to celebrate on, set into it. We have a mass every year on the date of Dr. Pusey's death. I
think if I understood correctly, Temple Moor always envisaged this part of the pulpitum as being a storage area, which we've been keeping.
So that's the actual mensa that Pusey celebrated on in his study at Christ Church every morning at 4 a.m. He had special permission from the bishop to do that.
If you via the Lyddon Room on your way out, there's the portrait, or the sketch really, of Dr. Pusey in his study with the table that became the altar that he celebrated in that.
You've got here the house's motto, held by angels.
3 altars.
3 altars in one chapel.
In one chapel.
Yeah, all used. It's quite fun actually when we have the mass up here, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sort of crowded in.
This is used on the anniversary of Dr. Pusey's death, as Harry said. Not the best attended service because we can't fit many people up here, but
we'd be in trouble if we wanted to come to that one.
But really nice to celebrate mass on that altar.
What we're looking at are 2 separate chapels, and you'll see when we go through how different they are in terms of character. This is very pared back, very scaled back.
Yes.
In terms of decoration. It's all about scale and not about ornament. And if you look up to the roof bosses, you've got going along all these Old Testament prophets. But you've got Daniel there, Ezekiel over there. I can't read what that one says. It's covered in cobwebs. So, but there's a whole scale. And then you've got things like the gifts of the Spirit and virtues and things in the side bosses. But there's a real program to the chapel, the 2 chapels, and that's because as we get through there, that's where the sacrament's reserved beyond the screen. The official name of the small chapel is the Chapel of the Blessed Sacrament.
Well, so when you do communion, you're bringing the sacrament from the chapel at the back.
So when Mass is held in here on a Sunday or on other occasions, usually the reserve sacrament is brought from the tabernacle in the Blessed Sacrament Chapel to the altar here. That's right. And then Mass is also said in the Blessed Sacrament Chapel on a daily basis.
I've seen so many places where they have a little chapel off to the side, or it's the Lady Chapel or whatever, but I don't think I've ever seen one where it's just one continuous alignment like this. That's that feels.
Well, the
monasteries.
Monasteries, priory churches. That would have been.
And this is based on Franciscan priories apparently.
That makes sense.
Despite the fact it looks like a medieval chapel in many ways, it's very much a 20th century chapel. It's always had electric lighting right from when it was begun.
Not that it makes it any.
Not that it makes any difference. No, we haven't got it on, but.
It's quite light and bright today. But are you saying sometimes it's dark in here?
Yes,
it is. Certainly, if you're trying to read your order of service or music or something, it's quite difficult. The lighting's not great. But the other thing that makes it a 20th century chapel, lots of people wonder what these sort of galleries are for.
Yeah.
Give it its official architectural term, it's a champenois passage, based on these French little passages you get in medieval French buildings. But Temple Moor, quite often in his buildings, put these in. You can't walk in them because they're only about that deep, and they're just to house hot water pipes so that the cold air coming down from the window is immediately counteracted. And it's these little touches that make it a modern chapel. It puzzled me for years what this window was all about here, a bit like a royal pew or something. Mm-hmm. People think someone must sit there, someone very important must have a stool there. They don't. It's just so when you have no idea what these windows are for, but they're perfectly placed so when the Mass is being celebrated, about 11:30 midday, at the right time of year, the sunlight will just come directly.
I mean, it's not exactly Indiana Jones and the
No, but that's no, but
the
I
map
can
room,
see
but
exactly
it works exactly
the effect.
like that,
Yeah.
especially with the incense in the air.
Yeah, it's a real sort of masterstroke of, and it's Temple Moore's sort of practical genius.
The house at that time, and consistently actually, has been part of a conversation. Thinking about unification has been part of the conversation, not just with the Roman Catholic expression of the Church, but the Orthodox. And so this presentation was made as part of one of those processes of working together, which continue to this day.
But it's I don't think it was Temple Moore's intention to actually have
Definitely
any depictions of anything in this chapel.
I mean, you can see that, can't you? From
these are all sort of
the later additions, the Stations of the Cross.
We haven't overdone it. I think you still do get this this sense of a scaled back chapel. Which will now be contrasted if we want to go through to the slightly more rich.
I've been in that one already, and it's the opposite, isn't it?
So we're actually underneath the rood screen now, coming through, and you suddenly see how it changes, and that was Temple Moore's intention. Although the elephant in the room, the big gold ciborium at the end, is not Temple Moore. You can go and have a.
So what did you call it?
Well, I call it a ciborium. I think
it's a baldacchino,
we call it a baldacchino, but Comper would have called it a ciborium.
Yeah.
I don't know what either of those mean.
Well,
this is a distinction. It's one of those. Okay, but what's it reflecting? I mean, was there something in the Temple of Jerusalem that
I have always thought, and I'll be very surprised if this isn't somewhere in the thinking. Its sort of arrangement as a cube is certainly suggestive of the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle and latterly in the temples. And similarly, the gold sort of theme, which stands out more here than it might in many contexts because of the spare decor of the Chapel of the Resurrection, and even coming into here. It's often when you bring people round just to look at the chapel, I often, especially groups, I often say, I'd be interested to know what your natural visual focus is. And I mean, it's obvious, not just because of the orientation, but also because someone's drawn a big gold box around the most important focal point.
There's a wonderful, what Comper was trying to achieve in all his works throughout his career was putting the altar as the focal point of the church. And he said that the church is a lantern and the altar the flame within. He's referring to St. Cyprian's, I think. Then.
Yeah. And it looks like that. It has that effect. And the fact that Comper added it latterly, as it were, somehow seems to emphasise that. There's something rather lovely for me as a priest in this space of thinking Temple Moore, who incredibly sensitively captured exactly what and Harry's already said it, what the governors, what I think the founding vision of the place and the chapter wanted this construction to do and to be, with incredible sensitivity and incredible attention to detail. But in fact, the sort of centerpiece to which it all leads was empty. It was waiting for something to be done that he didn't do. And this absolutely wasn't a deliberate intent, but by God's providence, there's something very appropriate about that sort of vision of what the sort of human architect is doing in building, much like Solomon, building a house that can't contain the thing that it's for, and that in fact that beating heart at the centre of it comes is brought by someone other than the human architect, or in this case another architect.
But it's also really doubling down on the difference between that space and this space.
Yes, I mean, but in terms of specifically in terms of focus, so you can't see because of the altar cloth, but this whole axis, the sort of central point of the central focus, is a hymn to the Incarnation. A bit behind, perhaps we'll reveal it actually, but behind the altar cloth is a beautiful frontispiece of the Annunciation, the real presence of Christ in his sacrament, but the cross, the resurrection, the glorified Christ in this continual line that is the sort of folding point of the entire space. And so in terms of what it communicates and wants to communicate, and I use the term advisedly, it's I think it's a brilliant and beautiful piece of completing work for the whole project.
Nobody thought about altars as carefully as Comper. But a very interesting thing happened in Comper's development as an architect. If you go to early Comper church, you'll see what he called an English altar, which is that sort of altar that you might see with curtains around it, called riddle posts and riddle curtains. You know, the sort of sticks with angels on top holding candlesticks.
Oh, yes.
Based on this very careful research from what an English church might have looked like before the Reformation. Comper and lots of that generation in the late 19th century were very interested in the ornaments rubric, which is the rubric in the prayer book that suggests that we ought to keep churches in the same way that they were in whatever year of the reign of whatever king. So he was very obsessed in that early period of creating these perfect medieval visions of what an English church would have looked like. In 1900, he went to Rome on holiday, had a conversion at Rome, not to the Roman Catholic Church, but to this idea of unity by inclusion, which he saw, as he observed it, that the folds in the fabrics of these statues made in Rome were exactly the same as those he'd seen in East Anglia, and that actually all artistic creation, all devotional artistic creation, was connected by that same sort of, divine inspiration in itself. And he saw no reason to be bigoted about, well, that wouldn't have been in an English church, or we've got to stay Gothic. So what you'll notice is that it's a classical, with these classical columns in the middle of a Gothic church, and it works. I think it works.
It really does.
And it is the perfect example, I think the best example actually, because he's making an intervention in a fairly new chapel as well that's entirely Gothic. It is the perfect summing up of that idea of unity by inclusion, and it works.
That's a Jesse window.
It is.
I think it's probably the least busy Jesse window I've ever seen.
Comper is exactly what he wanted, that sort of pearly whiteness, that white light, which is what you get from late medieval English glass. It's All Souls being a good example, and this sort of clear light coming through the glass. And the other key thing about late medieval English glass with the scale of the figures, practically life-size, not quite, but as big as, Comper said, as big as the lights could afford, and with as little leading as can be afforded. Comper actually made his own glass. He had a glass oven in his house. It was all made on site, and his goal was to create as bigger panels as possible. And Comper actually argued at one point, when he was referring to some of his glass at downside, he said that what Milton called dim religious light wasn't any sort of gloom, it wasn't darkness, it was the light that was thrown off by late medieval English glass, this sort of pearly whiteness, dimmed but not dark.
Yes.
And that's exactly what
Not
that
dull.
is.
Yeah.
Not dull. Yeah. Jesse window, and you've got Christ Pantocrator, Virgin and Child there. He always based that figure on his wife, Grace Bucknell. You've also at the bottom, as a sort of donor image, where you've got Dr. Pusey kneeling in coats of arms at the top too. In the central lights, in the side lights, you've got University of Oxford, Christchurch, Oriel, and the City of Oxford, which all helped support the foundation of the house, gave land and things. And the two shields in the central light, on the right, the red and white stripy one is Pusey, and then on the left, it's Pusey quartered with Bouverie. His actual full name was Edward Bouverie Pusey. And that's where you get these double-headed eagles. Actually, when you look at old photos, the lozenges, which are now pure gold, actually had that red and white striped shield.
Oh, did they?
Painted in. It'd be good to restore them. So
Oh, really? I
it's
didn't know that.
his heraldic.
Oh, it would be good, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think we should restore it, really. But, yeah. That's one for chapter.
I've got some
chapter,
brushes.
next week. Yeah.
I think Ali's just bought some brushes. So.
Get up there on your
Or a roller would do it, wouldn't it?
You've got this 3-metre pole, haven't you? It works in communication with each other because you've got Christ in judgment up there, and you've got him resurrected here. Classic Comper, you don't see a Comper Christ with a beard very often, and this is no exception.
That's the moment of resurrection, which is why we've got the guards from the tomb.
It is, although Harry, you could probably answer this question for me, because I've always, when talking to people about the chapel, I've always been inclined to think and therefore to say, is this a sort of... is this a simultaneous resurrection and ascension? Because he's not actually touching the ground. And if it is, that's there's something wonderful about that.
He's actually balanced on. I've been up on a ladder behind, and you can see the way is actually his cloak.
Yes,
is
exactly.
what's holding him up.
Yeah,
it's not even the staff.
It's like those Yodas outside of...
Yes, exactly.
See, I thought that, and I thought, I'm not going to say that.
I'm going to go now.
I've also always thought, and again, you can tell me if this is wrong and just totally impossible to substantiate, but that his what he's shrouded in, his cloak, as you put it, is an allusion to the veil, the tabernacle veil, because of its very deliberate blue and gold. I know there's a blue and gold theme, but it's always struck me that it would be very appropriate for him to be shrouded in the temple veil as he rose and ascended.
I'm sure Comper was a very astute theological mind. So.
Exactly.
But all the figures are copied from 16th century Italian pictures. So
really, I was going to say, because that's that's not your traditional image of Christ, but it's clearly the same figure in the front statue and in the stained glass.
In terms of the model
yes,
is. I'm trying to remember the name of the artist now. It's a sort of actually quite a middling Italian picture of the resurrection that he's based Christ on there. But in that image, Christ was bearded and looked old, and Comper based his figures of Christ on a number of models, one of whom was Nijinsky, the ballerina.
Really?
Yeah.
Not the racehorse.
Not the racehorse. No. It's a very different.
I can see that absolutely.
Yeah, but the idea was that lots of people think Comper was frivolous and just think, oh well, it's a sort of, it's just he liked ballet, so he just put Nijinsky as a Christ because why not? It's not frivolous at all because what Comper was trying to represent was Christ, who was sort of physically powerful and at the height of his power, not a sort of cowed, weak-looking man. You can now see the frontal, and this is Comper would have called this a frontal. It's beaten metal, and you've got the Annunciation there. Comper did an amazing thing. The angels are Botticelli. I know that, and Comper in the drawings which survive at the Royal Institute of the British Architects archive. It took me years to work out what he was doing because you see these Comper drawings with a little code saying something like Li.2.6.1. I just could never work it out, and I thought, well, that's going to be a mystery next to all these figures. And it was only when I was looking in another archive that I found this huge collection of portfolios with labels like German, late Italian, early Italian, and postcards, cuttings from newspapers of images. And what he'd do is every single figure had a precedent in a picture within these portfolios, and he actually referenced it in his drawings. So LI means late Italian, point 2 means a particular postcard within that.
So when you realise that must have been...
It was, and it really opens up his work because you can trace, and he only started doing this about 1910, I think. He only started writing it down then, but you can actually trace back every little bit, and he'll do an amazing thing. Like I think the Annunciation, I can't remember off the top of my head, but the crossed hands are from one source, the heads from another source, the angels from another source, the vases from another source, and it all comes together as a whole. So it's an original artwork made up of lots of existing. If we come around here, we can see, getting onto the history of how this came to be in the chapel, this little tomb. Oh, it's not a tomb, there's no burial connected with it, but this stone here with a coat of arms in brass inlaid into it. Latin translation, this altar was donated by Edith Diana Powell, and Lady Powell was the wife of the physician to Victoria and Edward VII and George V. Made a lot of money through that work. And she was related to the Burneys, to sort of Charles Burney and Fanny Burney. She left money in her will for an Anglo-Catholic cause, left money to the house, and that was the purpose it was set to, an Anglo-Catholic cause. And I think the thought at the time was that it might be spent on doing some work out in the suburbs or something, or putting it to good use, feeding the poor or something. But Freddie Hood, who was principal at the time, had other ideas, and he was good friends with Comper. He was in many ways quite a worldly man, Freddie Hood. He was good friends with Comper, and he said, "Come and build a big gold ciborium in my chapel." And in the long term, I think I'm quite grateful for it. But it was the legacy of Lady Powell that actually had this built. Nothing really gets done architecturally in buildings like this without a donor.
No.
Well, and if you think about her, if that was indeed her aim for her legacy, I think it would be in keeping with the sentiments of the Anglo-Catholic revival.
This statue, often people think it's Comper. That's not. That was part of the original chapel. Temple Moore designed it, and that was another thing, like that stained glass window, that some very clever people got involved with. And there are all these letters saying Christ looks too unreal, but the Virgin looks too real, and should Christ have a crown, and should he be holding this in his right hand or his left hand, and it just went on and on and on.
Yeah.
In the end, Temple Moore redesigned it entirely, came up with that, which is practically a copy of a medieval statue of the Virgin and Child at York Minster by the Chapter House.
Designed by committee, never a good idea.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but I like the way the solution is to reference something that
Yes,
exists.
yeah, it
You know,
already
It's quite funny.
exists.
It's a
It
very
already
Comper way of
exists.
doing it,
Yeah,
actually.
yeah.
And Temple Moore and Comper did know each other, and I recall reading it somewhere. I've never been able to find out where now. I might have dreamt it, but Temple Moore, I think, said if anybody could come and reorder one of his churches, he'd want it to be Comper.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Oh wow, I did not know that either. That's extraordinary.
There's no misery chords.
No,
under
they're
there.
aren't,
uncarved.
there
They're
aren't.
uncarved.
There aren't yet.
Yes, I love that. Yeah.